All right, everybody, welcome back to Section 8 of the Comparative Criminology course. Let's go ahead and get started because today we are going to talk about two of the biggest issues in courtroom procedure, which are judges and later juries. So, judges are very, very different from country to country to country, and even sub-country, region to region to region. The judge's job can be different, very, very different, depending on where you are and what kind of judge you are. Some judges only do civil cases, some only do criminal cases, some only do appeals. Some are part of a team of judges, some work essentially alone. So judges have a lot of power, whether they're kind of in that only referee role like they are in the United States, or whether they are the sole determiner of guilt or innocence like they are in many inquisitorial systems. They have a lot of power. And as such, they're given a lot of freedom, but also as such, we want them to kind of represent the people, right? We want judges to be very similar looking in a lot of respects to the people that they're judging. And in the United States, we have kind of a bad history of making judges all look essentially the same. They're usually old white men, right? In fact, it was within my lifetime that my country got its first Supreme Court judge that wasn't an old white man. From the absolute beginning of our country in 1776 until a couple years after I was born, every single Supreme Court judge was an old white man. So it's a very good thing, in my opinion, that judges, especially on the Supreme Court, but also in other levels of court, are more reflective of the actual population of the United States. So, and that is both with age. We don't just want people who are of a generation that is very different than the generation that's kind of alive now, right? Or if all the judges are of retirement age, but the vast majority of who they're judging are late teens, early 20s, there's not necessarily that vast difference can cause misunderstanding. Race, of course, something like 12% of the United States population is black. Another, I can't remember how many, but double digits percentage is Hispanic. Another 4 or 5% are Asian. So we want the national kind of set of judges, both at a federal level, at a state level, and even at a county and city level, to kind of reflect those races. And then, of course, there's gender. In many, many, many countries, essentially all across the world, it's roughly 50-50 male and female. It can be 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points off from that, but the vast majority of the time, it's roughly 50-50. But judges are historically almost never 50-50 male and female. Just in kind of the 21st century, there are a few countries that have done a decent job making sure that roughly half of their judges are female and roughly half are male. But that's a relatively rare thing in the world. One of the more difficult issues with judges representing the people is with partisanship, i.e. political party. So, it's difficult for me to talk about political parties for other countries just because I don't have a lot of experience with political parties outside of the United States. But I can talk about things, here, in the United States, if you're unaware, we have two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And in the United States, the Supreme Court, which is kind of the most important court and which currently has 9 members, although it hasn't always been 9, Those 9 members are appointed for life, so until they choose to retire or until they die. And they're appointed by the president, and the president is obviously a Republican or a Democrat, but the judge is kind of theoretically expected to be nonpartisan, but in practice, that's really not true. When there is a divide, the vast majority of Supreme Court cases are 9-0, right? All of them agree one way or the other. But those aren't the kind of difficult cases. Those aren't the cases that people remember. In the difficult cases, when there's a split, it's almost always along party lines based on the party of the president that appointed that justice, right? And currently, as I'm recording this, there are 6 Republican-appointed judges and 3 Democratic-appointed judges on the Supreme Court. So officially they're nonpartisan, but in practice, In other countries, it's much more open. And even here in the United States, there are some states where they elect judges in partisan elections. So you'll have, a state Supreme Court judge who's running for office as a Republican or as a Democrat. But in a lot of cases, it's less openly partisan. And then, of course, there's a distinction between all courts and the high court. So there are a lot more countries where they have a roughly even balance of age and race and gender and partisanship in their lower courts, but the higher courts are still fairly non-equal in their representation of those factors, right? So when you're looking at whether a country has good representation based on these values above, you have to look not only at just their highest court, i.e. here in the United States, that would be the 9 members of the Supreme Court, but you have to look at all courts. In the United States, we want to look at the federal district courts and the federal appeals courts, and then the state Supreme Courts and the state district courts, and all those things. And there are thousands and thousands of judges. In some states and some levels of judgeship are more representative and some are less representative. Now, this one is really complicated. How are judges selected? How do you get to be a judge, right? There's essentially 4 different processes that are commonly used in different places and in different times. The first is appointment by head of state. As I said in the last slide, here in the United States, not only the Supreme Court, but all federal judges are appointed by the president. Confirmation has to come from the Senate, but that usually does. It's fairly rare for them to reject a president's appointment. But the head of state, i.e. the president in this case, just appoints federal judges. In some states, the governor appoints judges. In other countries, a lot of times there'll be an appointment by the assembly. So this is especially common in like South America, where their assembly, whether that's they could call it the parliament, they could call it representatives, they could call it a senate, they could call it whatever they want. But that kind of elected assembly gets together and votes on who gets to be a judge or not. There's direct election. This is where as I mentioned in the last slide, many times judges will run for election. Sometimes it's a partisan race, i.e. the judges run as a Republican or a Democrat. And sometimes it's a nonpartisan race where judges aren't allowed to kind of talk about their political affiliation. They just have to kind of put their name on the ballot and say, this is what I want to do as the judge. But they're elected directly by the people during their regular yearly or bi-yearly elections. The fourth is co-option. This is where current judges choose the new judges. So basically for that district, there will be some panel of judges, and they'll get together and say, hey, we have an opening for a new judge. Let's all get together and figure out who we want to join that, and then whoever they pick joins those other existing judges. But in a lot of cases, it's not just one of these 4 methods that are used to select judges. It's a hybrid system, right? So I'll give you a good example. I am currently living in the state of Tennessee, and our judges are appointed by the governor, right? Appointed by the head of state. But after every so often, after so many years, those judges are voted on by the people. So I, in fact, as I'm recording this, just went and voted a couple days ago. And one of the things on the ballot was a list of all the different judges. And each one had, would you like to retain this person or would you like to replace this person? And I got to vote whether to retain that person and let them continue in the job of doing the judge that they've been doing for a few years, or in some cases many years, or replace. And then if any individual judge, if they get more replace votes than they get retain votes, they're no longer a judge, and the governor gets to appoint someone new to fill that spot. So that's a hybrid system of both appointment by a head of state and direct election at different stages in the process, right? And in many/most countries, many/most of the judges are appointed by one of these hybrid systems rather than just any one single system alone. Now, what are the problems with these selection issues? Obviously, one of the things we have to worry about is political partiality. When you're running as a Republican or a Democrat, you're probably going to let that influence how you do your job a lot more than if there truly was a nonpartisan judge. Not just nonpartisan in name, but nonpartisan in actuality. So when you when you kind of involve politics and whether judges should be judges, that can cause a lot of issues both for the judge and for the people in their courtroom, and also for other elected representatives. A lot of times, a lot of these judges can be out of touch, right? And again, not just because they're often of different ages and different races and different genders than the people they're judging and the kind of common community that they're in and asked to judge, but also because of things, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life here in the United States. In fact, all federal judges are appointed for life. So until they decide to retire or they die. And there are cases, like there's currently, again, as of this recording, there's a Supreme Court judge that has been on the bench for almost 40 years. And when you're a Supreme Court judge for that amount of time, it means you kind of become out of touch with current values and current community processes. You've been kind of, in the Supreme Court and out of the common community for so long that you've kind of lost touch with the community around you. So when you kind of become a judge, you become, to some respect, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot, an other. You're no longer like any other member of the community. And then finally, there's the protection of independence, right? We really want judges to be independent. Like the ultimate goal, hopefully, everybody around the world, we want our judges to be truly independent and as objective as they can be. So when that judge's job is subject to things like, direct election, instead of being independent, that judge is now going to have a vested interest in doing what the voters want. So that can cause issues and cause them to be less independent and objective than we actually want them to be. Now, this process is vastly different in authoritarian states, right? Countries or regions of countries where the government is, more authoritarian style. They don't want necessarily justice. They don't necessarily want judges to be independent. They want them to be loyal. And because of that, often in these authoritarian states, judges aren't selected for their competence. They're selected for their loyalty. So you could be a complete, have no idea what you're doing as a lawyer or as a law professional, But hey, you're a judge now because you were loyal to our party or our king or our emperor or dictator or whatever you want to call him. When an authoritarian takes power, one of the first things they do often is to either fire or outright murder the existing judges because they don't want kind of enemies of their regime with that kind of power. And then once those old judges were fired or outright murdered, they can replace them with loyal judges of their own choosing. And another one of the very disturbing processes is secret courts, right? So one of the kind of prime focuses of modern courts in kind of democratic or popular rule countries is that we want our court system to be open and honest and observable, and not necessarily televising every case and all the private information that goes on, but we want it to be kind of accessible for the people to keep an eye on it and make sure it's not becoming corrupt. So often authoritarians will create secret courts that they're not open to that kind of scrutiny, and thus can kind of do whatever they want and perform the evil process and the evil impacts that the authoritarian state wants it to have. So this is really what we got to look out for. Okay, now that's the end of our conversation about judges. We're going to be back in just a minute to continue our discussion with juries.